sexy guys. Explore what sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. And about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So, Mark, we're back on opposite coasts after that one-time diversion of being in the same room for our last episode, which was really a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, properly social distanced by 3,000 miles.
Yes, that's right. And today's topic is legacy admissions. And it is a timely topic, I noticed this week reading the paper, because earlier this week, California banned private colleges and universities from granting legacy preferences, starting in the fall of next year.
Okay, I did not see that. I did my research before that came down, so thank you for adding that.
Yeah, well, I think their public system had been legacy-free for a while. I don't know how long, maybe you do, but they just banned it for private colleges and universities this week. So this topic is certainly timely. And, my thinking about this topic really started last year after the Supreme Court banned affirmative action. And a lot of objections were raised about how fair is it that we're now banning race from being considered in college admissions while we're still allowing the children of wealthy donors and alumni to get into those schools via this legacy backdoor.
Yeah.
So I asked you two questions. One was, how prevalent are legacy admissions policies in American colleges and universities? Because I really don't know the answer to that, and I suspect a lot of people don't. And then, are there any good reasons for retaining these policies? So I'm anxious to hear your answer to this.
So as always, thank you for the question. And I have to say that for a significant portion of my life, I was unaware that legacy admissions existed. Both my parents were alumni of UC Berkeley, but I never even considered applying there when I was thinking about where I should go to college. And I don't remember my mother recommending it either.
It was a non-issue for me, too, because my father didn't go to college and my mother went to state college in her 40s when I was in high school. So there really was no legacy to consider whatsoever for my college admission.
Sure. When I was at Harvard for my master's degree, I did meet a good number of students who had other Harvard grads in the family, but I never put two and two together. But now, thanks to your question, I have a much clearer picture of the practice. Legacy admissions, if any of our listeners is wondering, is the practice within colleges and universities' admissions departments of giving preferential treatment to close relatives of previous graduates of that institution. If your father graduated from Yale and you later got into Yale despite middling grades, you might have been the beneficiary of legacy admissions. And the practice has a history that goes back almost exactly 100 years in this country. In the early 1920s, Ivy League colleges were considering how to respond to some of the ways that America was changing back then. Originally, these institutions had been founded by Protestants and were intended for Protestants. Harvard, for instance, was originally a divinity school and only later expanded into other areas of study. And so over their first century or so of history, these colleges and institutions served a fairly homogeneous student body. They were white, they were almost entirely male, and they were largely Protestant, the prototypical WASP institution. Between the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century, however, there was a mass emigration of Jewish people from Eastern and Southern Europe. During that period, 2.8 million European Jews immigrated to the United States, with 94% of them coming from Eastern Europe. And by the early 1900s, admissions departments were seeing new types of applicants. They were still white and mostly male, but more and more descendants of these Jewish immigrants to the U.S. were applying to colleges and universities. Admissions departments at the time might have been able to make their peace with Catholic students, for example, so long as they didn't make a big deal about practicing their faith, but Jewish students were another matter entirely. This was a period of time in which casual anti-Semitism was more the norm than the exception in Europe and the U.S., and so there was concern that this influx of Jewish students would irrevocably change the character and values of America's most prestigious educational institutions. This is the scenario that gave birth to legacy admissions, particularly in the Northeast where Jewish populations were concentrated. The practice evolved of setting aside a certain number of seats within the student body for the descendants of previous students. Since very few of these previous students had been Jewish, this served as a means of making it more difficult for Jewish students to gain admission. On top of this, there were more explicit methods of keeping Jews out of the Ivy League schools. Some schools specifically assigned religious quotas, while others limited applications from geographies known to contain Jewish neighborhoods, required information about religion and birthplace on the application, required applicants to submit photographs, made them pass intelligence tests that were designed to be more difficult for students with diverse backgrounds, or required that they submit letters of reference from alumni. These tactics were targeted primarily at Jewish applicants, but they had the effect of limiting access to Catholic applicants as well, not to mention others who were the first in their family to apply to an Ivy League school.
Yeah. The key being the word other in that last sentence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm hearing from you here is that anti-Semitism is the proximate cause of legacy admissions, which I guess shouldn't surprise us at all. But more largely speaking, xenophobia is the issue here, right?
Yeah.
And xenophobia, for any of our younger listeners, is not unique to the MAGA cult. It has a long and noxious history in our country.
Yeah. And in fact, at least for a certain time period, was deeply embedded in institutions of higher learning where you would expect a more educated and open-minded perspective, but often not.
Yes, right.
Most of these barriers to higher education for Jewish students were removed after World War II, when the optics of such openly anti-Semitic practices could not have been worse. Still, legacy admissions lived on as a practice in American higher education and came to be used by schools outside of the Ivy League as well. Legacy admissions processes are a widespread practice today. A 2020 Wall Street Journal report found that 56% of the nation's top 250 colleges and universities considered legacy status in their admissions processes.
50%?
56%.
Wow.
This was down from 63% in 2004, so the practice has declined recently. More than 100 colleges and universities have stopped considering legacy status in their admissions processes since 2015, including institutions like Texas A&M University, Purdue University, the California Institute of Technology, Johns Hopkins University, Wesleyan University, the University of Minnesota, and Amherst College. Less than 25% of public four-year institutions consider legacy status in their admissions. Among the most selective schools, though, the practice is far more common. If you look at institutions that admit less than 25% of total applicants, 80% of those schools, or 4 in 5, consider legacy status. These schools are commonly private colleges, particularly those in the northeastern U.S. that have a long history of legacy admissions. And yes, Joe, in case you were wondering, our alma mater, the University of Chicago, does consider legacy status in its admission process. Largely, this is because of money. Schools might have instituted legacy admissions for racist reasons, but they quickly figured out that considering legacy status in admissions is a good way of soliciting donations from wealthy alumni who not only have a personal connection to the school, but also can reasonably expect that their children will be students as well. And since those legacy admissions are more likely to be from wealthy families, they are less likely to require financial aid and so provide a second financial benefit to the school. The benefits to an applicant of legacy status are significant. A 2020 study focusing on Harvard's admissions practices, conducted by professors from Duke, Georgia, and Oklahoma, found that legacy applicants were 5 times more likely to be accepted compared to non-legacy applicants. And legacy preferences disproportionately benefit white students. At Notre Dame, for instance, 21% of the freshman class in 2020 were legacy students, while only 4% were Black. 34% of Harvard undergraduate students overall are white, but more than 75% of Harvard legacy admissions are white, underscoring how non-diverse the legacy population continues to be. It goes without saying that legacy admissions have been widely criticized as giving unfair advantages to applicants with family connections, regardless of merit, and of contributing to a cycle of privilege by favoring students from already advantaged backgrounds. In addition, legacy admissions has been particularly criticized as hindering efforts to diversify student bodies and create equal opportunities for students from all backgrounds. And of course it has, because legacy status was originally conceived as a way of preserving the non-diverse heritage of elite institutions. But this criticism has only gained force now that the Supreme Court has ruled that it is unconstitutional for these same schools to consider race in their admissions processes. Just months after the Supreme Court handed down that decision in the summer of 2022, lawyers for civil rights filed a complaint with the Education Department alleging that Harvard's legacy admissions policy discriminates against Black, Hispanic, and Asian applicants by favoring white applicants with alumni ties. The Education Department, prompted by the complaint, opened a civil rights investigation into Harvard's admissions practices, specifically examining whether the use of legacy and donor preferences constitutes racial discrimination. This investigation is still ongoing, but it opens the door to potential lawsuits and could force universities to defend their legacy policies in court.
Yeah, and I have to say, I welcome that investigation because I feel like the Supreme Court only did half the job by banning affirmative action for Black students, minority students.
Right.
They conveniently neglected to ban the de facto affirmative action for white students and rich students, which is legacy admissions.
Right.
So why not? If you're going to excise the tumor, get rid of all of the tumor, right?
Yeah, unless you want to argue that benefiting white rich Americans is a cherished part of American heritage that goes back to the beginnings of this nation.
Yes.
But I personally will not go there. Nonetheless, there are people who even today argue on behalf of legacy admissions policies. One argument is that legacy status is only one of many factors considered in the admissions process, and in the grand scheme of things, it does not have a significant effect on the students chosen. This is, by the way, the defense that the University of Chicago offers for its own legacy admissions practice. And that sort of claim is hard to disprove. You'd need to be in the admissions office to really know how big an effect legacy status has on the decisions being made. I will, however, remind our listeners of that study indicating that legacy applicants at Harvard are 5 times more likely to be admitted than non-legacy applicants, which suggests that legacy status is actually a pretty powerful predictor of admission. The second argument revolves around community. Legacy admissions, they say, foster a sense of community and tradition within universities by strengthening the ties between alumni and their alma maters. If you went to the same school as your father and your grandfather, the argument goes, that means something and it creates a sense of history and continuity within the institution. The third argument, though, is the real one, and it gets back to money. There is a belief that legacy admissions encourage alumni donations, and those donations provide crucial funding for those schools. In 2019, alumni donations amounted to $11 billion, which was 22.6% of the financial intake of America's colleges and universities that year. Without these donations, the argument goes, schools would be starved for cash, and they would need to cut back on such things as scientific research, facilities for the student body, and scholarships for underprivileged students. This argument, in short, presents a sort of trickle-down economics model for legacy admissions. Legacy admissions encourages wealthy alumni to give generously, and those funds make it possible for schools to admit students who otherwise would not be able to afford tuition. At its heart, the debate over legacy admissions comes down to 2 philosophical perspectives. On the one hand, you have the deontologist school, which holds that the morality of an action depends on whether that action is itself inherently right or wrong. And on the other side of the debate, you have utilitarianism, which argues that an action can be judged to be right to the extent that it promotes the greatest overall happiness, and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be our guiding principle. At the center of the debate is the question, can a practice that is inherently unjust ever be justified if it has demonstrable positive societal outcomes. From a deontological perspective, legacy admissions are inherently wrong because they offer an unfair advantage to people with privileged backgrounds and further disadvantage applicants who are already struggling with structural inequalities in this country. From a utilitarian perspective, though, the question of whether legacy admissions are right or wrong depends on their ultimate consequences. That is to say, you can make a utilitarian argument that legacy admissions, if managed properly, can create a net positive outcome by sustaining educational institutions and broadening access for those who need financial aid. Personally, I can see merit in both of these perspectives. In my heart, it feels like legacy admissions are wrong. And how could they not be, considering that from the beginning the practice was grounded in racism and anti-Semitism? By the same token, however, I see the rationality of weighing the good of the collective against the good of any single individual. If something harms a small number of people in the short term, but ultimately creates a broad benefit for society, I can have sympathy for the few who suffer while recognizing the overall good that the practice creates. Even so, the utilitarian argument hinges on one simple question. Is it accurate to say that legacy admissions create a net positive outcome? That argument depends entirely on whether it's true that legacy admissions are the most effective strategy for bringing in alumni donations, but the evidence for that is inconclusive. One study looked into this question and argued that it's not legacy admissions practices that drive donations, but simply wealth. The more money families have, the more likely they are to make donations to schools, whether or not legacy policies are in place. And there are schools like MIT that have managed to maintain strong alumni giving despite having no legacy admissions policies. Similarly, Pomona College in California abandoned legacy admissions in 2017, and University President Gabrielle Starr has since reported that the college didn't observe a decline in donations after removing legacy preferences.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and it suggests that other factors such as alumni pride and institutional values might be more influential in driving philanthropic support.
With minds like steel tracks, walking door here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And explain, it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby, explain, it's a calling that you don't do it too.
And so ultimately, I feel like the burden of proof is on proponents of legacy admissions. The practice is inherently unjust. That seems obvious to me. While the supposed benefits of the practice appear to be far less obvious. I would need to see clear and evident proof that legacy admissions policies are, in fact, necessary to drive alumni giving. And then I'd need to peek into the books to verify that donor funds are, in fact, going to worthy things like research and financial aid before I'd be ready to support the practice. Until then, legacy policies seem to me more like reverse affirmative action.
Yeah.
A practice that began with anti-Semitism and continues to this day in shoring up the privileges of our white and mostly Protestant American upper class. What do you think about that?
Yeah, or affirmative action for white people, as I said, or rich people.
Yeah.
And the Venn diagram between rich people and white people is pretty close. So, yeah, I pretty much agree with where you're coming down on this. And it's very interesting to me that one of the foundational claims in favor of legacy admissions might not actually be true, that it increases alumni giving. So certainly the scrutiny should be on those pro arguments. They're the ones that we need to carefully think about before we approve any kind of legacy admission policies.
Yeah.
I have a lot of things to say about this. Just going over the arguments in favor of legacy, there's one cynical reason that colleges may employ legacy admissions, and that's because it improves the percentage of accepted offers they get, right? So if a lot of their applicants are legacies and they approve them at higher rates, as is demonstrated, as you mentioned, then their so-called yield rate, the accepted offer rate, is going to be higher. And that's going to improve the school's ranking in that bullshit U.S. News and World Report ranking,
Yeah.
you know? So I think that's another kind of calculated reason why they might continue to have legacy policies.
Yeah, I did run across that. I didn't include it because just on the face of it, I feel like schools like Harvard, Yale, University of Chicago, they already have high acceptance rates. So it's probably not a major driver at the elite institutions.
Right.
But I agree that it might be further down the chain. It might be a way of a state school, for instance, to goose its numbers to a certain extent.
Right. Or a mid-tier private. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. And then you did certainly mention the alumni engagement with the hopes that there'll be a financial benefit to the school that's multi-generational. But the schools use a lot of that airy-fairy language about promoting community building and generational bonding among their students. And I think that's another selling point for legacy admissions. But then moving to the arguments against, I don't think you mentioned what I would consider to be the single most important argument against retaining legacy admissions. And that is that it's just contrary to the whole idea of education as like a leveling force in our society. You know, education as something that contributes to equality of opportunity, economic mobility, social mobility. You know, it seems like legacy admission runs directly counter to that notion. And since that's one of the reasons why we have colleges and universities in the first place, I think it's a pretty damning indictment of legacy policies. I mean, what do you think about that?
It certainly does run counter to the notion that America is the land of opportunity and higher education is the means of getting there.
It's kind of a deontological argument, right? It's kind of grounded in morality, the morality of our country, or the morality that we profess is central to our country.
I think it's a critique that at its heart is rooted in something that's a little bit deeper, which is that this is one feature of the way in which things like this, the institutions of privilege as sort of an umbrella title that legacy admissions would fit under, just run counter to the idea of who we are supposed to be as a country, which is you are supposed to be the sort of country where your grandparents can immigrate to this country with, $5 in their pocket. And then 2 generations later, you're a student at Harvard.
Right.
And that's something that we like to say about ourselves. And that our understanding of what drives America as an exceptional country is that anyone with talent can rise through the ranks and take a place within our society. And then we have institutions like this that run entirely counter to that. And so I would agree. I think probably on the opposite side of that issue, the people who support legacy admissions do not see legacy admissions as running counter to that because they think they're giving opportunity to quality people. And that is an intrinsically racist mindset. But I don't think that people set out to be villains in anything that they do. People generally think that they're doing the right thing.
Yes.
And you support legacy admissions because you think those are the people who should be at schools,
Right.
like Harvard and Yale and the University of Chicago. And you are doing the right thing in giving them space because they're the people who should be there. And so I don't think that they would agree that they are running counter to America's sense of self. I think that they would, on some level, believe that they are instituting it.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I guess ultimately it comes down to whether you believe the financial argument that colleges will make kind of on the QT, you know? Do you believe that they will be short of cash if they eliminate legacy admissions?
Yeah.
I frankly find it hard to believe with the super elite institutions with their multi-billion-dollar endowments that they're going to be hurting for cash to,
Right.
subsidize tuition and resources for poor students if they eliminate legacy admissions. But at those lower levels, those schools we were talking about a few minutes ago who are kind of trying to reverse engineer their numbers so they look better on the U.S. News and World Report projections, those schools may indeed suffer they have much lesser endowments, and maybe eliminating legacy would take a critical chunk of their resources away, and it might actually backfire and end up they can only pay the tuition of fewer poor students and students of color.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows?
Yeah.
It's possible.
It's possible. The studies so far indicate that maybe that's not the case. I personally think that donors, especially major donors, they don't give money in the expectation that their family will be given preferential treatment. They give money to get their names on buildings, right?
Yeah, that's right.
If you go to the University of Washington, there's a number of buildings that have the name Gates on them. And that wasn't because they're carving out a space for their children. That's just because they had a lot of money to give. And it's kind of a nice benefit that if you endow a hall, that it becomes Gates Hall. My personal sense is that ego and the desire for heritage is a bigger driver than legacy status. But yes, the evidence is inconclusive. Further study is warranted.
Okay, well, I have two other things I wanted to bring up. And one is this kind of a thought experiment, a little bit off topic, but I want to see what you think about this. I was thinking about what if we flip this whole question, and consider the question of legacy admissions from the prospective donor's perspective, the alumni parent's perspective. I wonder if the act of donating to their alma mater is more about, feeling proud about their school and some kind of principled support for the school. Or is it cynically a quid pro quo? Like, I'm going to support this school the year before my child applies, and I know that's going to register with them, and then we'll indicate that we're a legacy applicant, and they're going to look and see that I donated, and then my child's going to get in. Yeah. I wonder if it's that cynical and quid pro quo. I don't swim in those waters. So what do you think about that?
I think that absolutely happens. You do hear about it every now and then. Some rich celebrity, like some B-grade actor and actress in Hollywood has a child who can't get into USC Film School. And then they make a donation and, oh, look at that. The kid got into the school. You hear about that because it gets written up. So I do know that it happens every now and then. I think the more powerful effect is retroactive. Like, imagine you're Joe Billionaire and you've got a son, a ne'er-do-well son who gets C's in school and he wants to go to Harvard, and you went to Harvard and Harvard denies him admission. I think the more powerful effect is that Harvard can expect every time that they go back out to Joe Billionaire as an alumnus and say, would you like to make a donation? He's going to be a little pissed off at Harvard for denying his kid, because it's not just this one-time donation, right? They go out to these people again and again asking for money. And so maybe the greater fear is that there will be this ripple of effect that if you don't let him in, then for decades, you're going to have this rich man who has a grudge against you, and it'll be so much harder to get money out of them. I could see where that would be a lingering effect that could actually have financial implications for a school.
Yeah, and I'll bet somebody's keeping data on that, right? I bet if we Googled this, we would find out that donations drop off if the child does not get admitted through the legacy backdoor. So, yeah. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, at the risk of undermining my whole rationale for asking you this question in the first place, but I want to kind of be devil's advocate now and say, why is the outrage about legacy admissions limited to education? Shouldn't we be opposed to nepotism everywhere? Like, I'm a huge New York Yankees fan, as you and all of our listeners know. And the Yankees this season started a new program about the history of the numbers worn by famous players, right? And it's an interview show where they interview somebody and talk about the story of their number. And guess who's hosting that show? The daughter of the general manager of the team, And when I learned that was such a turnoff. I had an instant revulsion. And even though the subject matter of the show might be interesting to me, there was no way in hell I was going to turn that show on ever, because I was just so disgusted about the nepotism there, you know?
Yeah.
So, so I guess the connection here is we seem to be having conniption about legacy admissions and lawsuits and a lot of public discussion, but nepotism more broadly hasn't been demonized in the same way, it seems to me. You know, if it were, we wouldn't have gotten George W. Bush as our president 20 years ago.
Sure.
You know? So, I mean, what do you think about that? Is this a blind spot? Are we focusing too much on the minutia of education and not broadening this topic?
I think the fundamental difference is that in the case of legacy status within admissions, it's institutionalized nepotism. It's nepotism that is built into a process that can be audited and studied. I do see outrage against nepotism showing up somewhere else. Like over the last few years, there's been this internet phenomenon of calling out so-called Nepo babies in Hollywood, which is the sons and daughters of famous actors and actresses who get cast in movies and television shows despite an evident lack of talent. And they get named and shamed as Nepo babies. And in some cases, there's been this angry back and forth within social media between these people claiming that, no, I didn't get this job just because of my father. And the internet saying, actually, no, clearly you did. So
that's interesting.
And so that's a thing where nepotism is being called out, but it's not institutionalized nepotism. It's more a nepotism through networks, which has existed for as long as there have been sons and daughters.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
There's never been any point in human history where having a well-connected parent didn't benefit the child.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so not tuned into movies and TV and actors and celebrities in that world. So I'd never even heard of Nepo babies. And I would have thought exactly the opposite, you know, like Robert Downey Jr. gets rave reviews for every movie he does. The son of Robert Downey, right? Kiefer Sutherland is a famous actor. He's the son of an actor. I didn't think it was a big deal. So I'm actually pleased to hear that some of these people are getting their comeuppance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was an interesting conversation, and I appreciate your answer there. You have a question for me for next time, right?
I do, yes. And it is grounded in a comment that we got from our listener on Facebook. So,
oh, wonderful.
Those of you out there with questions in the back of your mind, this is how you can get it on the podcast. And that listener asked about a number of things, one of which was the fact that Google is currently embroiled in 2 lawsuits around their dominance within search and whether that counts as an antitrust violation. And that got me thinking, we've already covered antitrust on this podcast, so we wouldn't go down that road again, but it really got me thinking about the history of Google. Within my experience, I'm old enough to remember when Google was a startup. I used Alta Vista back in the day for internet search, and then Google came along and changed everything. And for about 10 years, Google was one of my favorite companies because they just seemed like this source of new ideas that were constantly coming out and changing everything. Like Gmail, for instance, Google product that you would not have anticipated. And Gmail is something that I use every single day and have used for years and years and years.
Yeah. And their owners seemed like do-gooders too, at least at the beginning.
And it seems to me that Google lately is just a company that's trying to hold on to what it has. It protects its dominance in search and in advertising through means that some people hold to be antitrust violations. And its big idea with AI is to find a way to insert advertising into AI search results. So again, not really groundbreaking, not really forward-looking. And so my question isn't about Google per se. It's about companies like Google. They start out new and fresh and full of bold ideas and ready to change the world. And then at some point, they just become afraid and they work to preserve what they have. And so my question for you is, what makes a company run out of new ideas?
Wow. That's not the question I expected to hear from you when you first mentioned the name Google. But that's a really thought-provoking question. So I will look into that.
Okay. And I look forward to the conversation around it.
All right, so that's what you're in for next time, people. I will come back with a presentation on that subject. But we're finished with this episode. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
Say your kids it's a truant, but you're affluent. A member of the top 0.1%. There's a solution with a little collusion. Just hit princess to the school where the day went. They call it legacy admissions. The breaking of patricians is nepotism by another name. The college gets its money in the land of milk and honey, where rich alumni act without shame. Say you're a papist, but your kid's a rapist. Irredeemable human track, you have choices. Your school rejoices when you send them a big fat check. They call it legacy admissions, the plaything of patricians. It's nepotism by another name. The college gets its money in the land of milk and honey. If you're poor, you got no skin in this game. Justice is a stranger when dollars buy protection. No merit for the masses, just wealth's resurrection. They claim it's tradition, a dynasty's right, but it's a stacked deck in an unfair fight. The plaything of patricians, it's nepotism by another name. The college gets its money in the land of milk and honey. If you're poor, you got no skin in this game. Tear down the gates, burn down the halls, let the towers crumble as justice calls. No more privilege disguised as grace. The legacy falls. This country has a brand new face. They call it legacy. Put down the debate. They call it legacy. Put down the halls.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best man is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no faking, that would be uncool.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.